And now I'd like to invite Professor Thaïsa to introduce the first panel.
Thank you, and I just want to thank all of the people who've been part of this and join others in thanking them. We're going to go right into the first panel. I'm very excited to hear. We will be having a panel discussion around the idea of currency, which many of us might think of as money that makes flow, but it's also about ideas and questions. So I think this will be a really terrific panel. Johan van Papendorp will begin, and then we'll have Chelina, Odbert, and Arthur Adeya give a joint presentation. So with that, John, please.
Thank you. I couldn't get through customs with fresh flowers, so I thought I'll bring the picture. In bringing thank you from the southern tip of Africa for having invited us to this special event. And I'm feeling particularly emotional about this moment of introduction. Thank you very much for that. My focus will really be on an open space as green infrastructure. This is sort of jumping the gun now with this emotional moment, but it is the reality of the world that we're dealing with. And that's in reference to Cape Town in particular, where I spent most of my time. And it also happens to be Africa's most southern city. Now, the earliest Europeans who explored the sub-Sahara of Africa started in the mid-15th century, primarily driven by a desire to find trade routes, looking for slaves, and to spread Christianity. The Portuguese explorers, Vasco da Gama in particular, navigated around the southern tip of Africa, around about 1448. And he was really in search of the spice market of India and to open a sea route to Asia for the Dutch and the English, and France would follow as well. Now, Africa is the second largest continent after Asia. It's a big country. The continent carries 12% of the world's population, on 20% of the global land surface, and is rapidly expanding. And there was a reference to the 1 in 4, and that was quite an impact. It consists of 54 countries, of many ethnic groups. They talk about 1,000, I don't know, or 2,000, we don't really know. And Africa has also a rapidly expanding population. They're talking about present population being about 1.5 billion and increasing by 3% per annum. That brings us to more than 40, and then about 40% of these people are under 15. And that is going to make a huge impact on our future. It is projected that Africa's population will double by 2050 with about 70%. And the reference again to the 1 in 4 in terms of population of the world. That's big numbers. It's got to be accommodated. So our established settlements will have to expand, or they've got to densify. New cities will have to be built, many new cities. So how are we going to build, we as professionals, how are we going to deal with it and address the spatial needs of livable environments? And I put emphasis on livable. We have when I say we as mankind has built the most incredible roads, bridges, aqueducts, for many millenniums. And we generally refer to that as built infrastructure, BI. Now, when I saw this image, I thought, my gosh, what is this telling me? And then I read the title. It's we're looking down the Thames River Tideway Tunnel, a 25-kilometer-long sewer tunnel built below London to minimize pollution of the River Thames. This image denotes what humankind is capable of. What we now call for is that green infrastructure, which has been on the boards for maybe 10 or 15 years, but that it not be a add to if there's money left, but that it be given the same attention as B1, built environment, to the present and future African cities, and I would apply to the rest of the world as well. Green infrastructure is considered as community's natural life support system, the ecological framework necessary for environmental and ecological sustainability. GI, or let me call it green infrastructure, is not simply an alternative description for conventional open space, parks, sports fields, wetlands, but also street trees, private gardens, urban farming, green roofs, and walls. Now, multifunctionality is another add to this, is the entire focus of green infrastructure, along with connectivity. So those two elements, the multifunctionalism and the connection of those spaces are prime for green infrastructure to be operational. The key features of green infrastructure are that it is a network of open spaces and features, not just individual elements. This is the entire landscape matrix, and these can be sustainable drainage systems and flood control methods, support environmental resilience, climate change mitigation, support for people's mental health and physical health, deliver social, cultural, and economic benefits, to shape urban form, very important, and sense of place, equally important. To be truly effective, green infrastructure should be fully integrated into the planning and design process right from the start, thereby providing multiple benefits to site conditions, making construction easier and cost-effective. Now a little history. The World Agenda for Green Infrastructure, being a response to climate change and public health, was foreshadowed by Birkenhead Park in 1984. Birkenhead Park is considered as the first people's park, purposely built with public funding by a local authority for all its citizens, a place where the barriers of social class, change, age, color, and creed are non-existent. This is a masterpiece of Joseph Paxton, which was a highly imaginative landscape designer of that time. Birkenhead Park is considered as a milestone in the evolution of designed landscape, and particularly of multifunctional landscapes. The park opened in 1847, and 4 years later, young farmer and journalist Frederick Law Olmsted was on a walking tour in the north of England when he stopped at the local bakery, and this baker said, why don't you go look at our new park? Olmsted was so taken with this park, what he found, that he came back here, where he became the first to be known as a landscape architect. He went on to build, obviously Central Park in New York, which he sort of coined as a truly democratic space where people of all backgrounds, rich and poor, can congregate and enjoy leisurely activities. He went on to build over 100 parks, including the Boston Emerald Necklace. We traveled it yesterday. Wow, what a place. A multifunctional, interconnected park system, giving structure to the city's growth and inspiring many other cities to follow. Funny enough, about 50 years ago, I did the same travel on a bicycle with my good friend at the time. And somehow it sort of stays in the back of my mind all of this time. Many cities were influenced by this, and I think we think about what they've done to Paris, the good and the bad. Certainly we look at the good, and it's very impressive. And then back here, I mean, I'm really looking, well, I guess France was one of the places. Singapore, in later years, also came to the table, and that somehow a lot of Olmsted's concepts and principles are reflected there. And yes, of course, Cape Town. I mean, we talk about it. Now, that's the city, southern end of Africa, Cape Town. You can see in the center there sort of a green space, and that green space sort of connect down and ultimately meet the ocean, or used to. It was cut off in later years. We're looking from top of Table Mountain. Probably the most iconic natural feature a city can have. At ground level, the peninsula is defined by ocean, a mountain chain with drains from mountain streams to a network of rivers and lakes, all having combined over 3 centuries to shape the present metropolitan settlement patterns. Sorry, we missed something over here. Just to put you in place, there's Southern Africa. We are bottom left corner, bottom tip. That's where Cape Town is. And city over here, the city metropole is really this whole peninsula area there. Now, this is what the city is today, the city center area around Table Mountain. Going back in time, it was in 1655 when the Dutch East Indian Company, which was a major, very wealthy operation in that time, established a small refreshment kiosk or outpost at the tip of Africa, where the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans meet. Colonizing the southern end of Africa as a permanent settlement was at that time not intended. The Khoisan, which are the people who lived here, nomadic hunters and gatherers moving around South African coastlines for then over 200,000 years, had limited contact with the early explorers, viewing the South African coastline as too dangerous for sailing ships and place to find anchor. It was only in 1652 when the East Indian Company saw it fit to establish a halfway station at the Cape of Good Hope. It was not seen as a colony at the time. It was simply to provide this station for the people halfway en route to India to go and buy peppers and so on, and then return to the European market with the full ship. The health aspect was essential because people were suffering, and they had to have fresh water and fresh food. Then somehow the location, the establishment, the garden sort of expanded, and people started to settle here slowly, and for various reasons, escaping from Europe for all the disasters and tension that was there, looking for new land, new opportunities. And the little village started to grow, and it's interesting that the garden itself, and here you can, here you can see the, no, there's the wrong one. Oh, sorry, this one. Got the wrong one. This was typically the garden layout, how it started, and it's very much a Dutch sort of method of 4 squares divided by 4 pathways, or 2 pathways crossing in the center, and this sort of just doubled up and doubled up and doubled up. And interesting enough, what happened is that the town took on that pattern. It was one of the early patterns of town development subdivision where you had very relatively small blocks, which still today is considered the best form of city building in terms of accessibility, flexibility. So the city growth, and by the 19th century, it was known as the, where's my last one? Not the Cape of Good Hope, it was called the Tavern of the Seas, because it was a major intersection. There were a lot of ships coming past. I mean, that was before the Egyptian Canal was open. You know, in those days, people used to go across the land up in the north. Now they're coming around the Cape Point, sailing. And so it became a real hub of activity and energy in a lot of pubs. So by 1900, there was the established harbour, and Cape Town very soon, and it had this grand, around by 1900, 1910, it had this incredible promenade for the Victorian Europeans to do their Sunday stroll, what have you. But it was an incredible link to the ocean. This link got lost because there was a landfill, a major landfill. The city by 1930s required more land. It was limited by the mountain and the ocean, and a huge area of about 200 acres of land was filled in, and the city was virtually, keep on picking the wrong point, the wrong stick. The city, that is where the beach line was before. That's the distance that it's been divorced from the beach. And then it was the major plan, the grand plan that was sort of imported from other worlds and applied here, hoping to create this grand new city. It really ended up as being a windswept desert for the next 30 or 40 years. And with high rises and really a very unpleasant environment. And I even remember it from about 30 years ago. Another place you really want to settle or be. And this led to a couple of officials, and they went and studied other places. They went to Sydney, for instance, or cities that they thought were doing very well. And they came back and said, you know, the Cape has got such an incredible environment and natural environment systems of rivers and streams, and of course the mountain is the backdrop, how scenic it can be, and we've got to take a different approach to how we deal with this city, with the urban form. That the emphasis should be really to start to enhance the city's environment, to form part of it rather than focus the mind, the planning mind on building freeways and highways. Let's think about the spaces, the natural spaces, to give us the guide to how to build and where we should build. Now today, some 40 years later, the concept of interconnected public spaces, which became part of the original study, is making an imprint on the city bowl and is re-establishing the historic link between the Atlantic coastline and the historic city centre and the iconic Table Mountain. The city's policies of densification and maximisation of the existing infrastructure are enforced. The green network becomes increasingly crucial to quality city living and becomes viable as a system. The greening study considered 2 levels of open space: the landscape framework, which is the bigger framework on the bigger space, and then of course the landscape web, which is more detailed at local community levels. And these are a number of parks, and this is quite an interesting diagram. Here we go again, which shows you leading from the mountain to the ocean, and this is where the gardens, the first garden in the city. I mean, the city really is there because of a garden, isn't it? So that was the garden, and it's now a historic garden with all the parliamentary buildings and libraries and museums and so on cluttered around it. This is old reservoir spaces, which is now beginning to be developed as part of the system. And this is a park linking up to the mountain. This is the public gardens, now no more a garden, but a public space, very formalized, and there are some museums and art galleries. But what is important about it is there is an avenue that links you down to the city and back towards the mountain. In the study, or the greening study, they also got down to the detail of pedestrianizing the city, or parts of it, because it really has just become a traffic environment, vehicular traffic, and developed, again, a link which started from the gardens and continued down towards the ocean, but picking up some of the squares that was now parking lot, or then parking lots, has now been turned into proper squares, and it really has become an incredible place where people come together, and the change has also been very obvious in terms of cultural changes, the dominance of other cultures that's come to the city. In fact, it's so heavily used that now, 40 years later, they're about to revamp the whole place because it's become a bit tired. All the old beautiful furniture and so on has sort of started to collapse, so on. Now, going back to the mountain, you can see this, again, looking at the green space linking down there, you can actually come up here and look at it from the mountain and get a sense of it. And the desire to make that connection, because we now, we can't get to the ocean because too many barriers, but so let's at least get back to the mountain. And the tabletop, so the way to get to the mountain is you either take the cable car or you climb a fairly steep climb, but a very pleasant one. On top of the mountain, and this is the tabletop that we're looking at here, it was over years really trampled, and the little bit of vegetation that there is quite sensitive. It's really endemic to the area, so there's been a great effort to protect it, and a pathway system was developed in order to keep people, or to protect what is left of vegetation. But it's again a great experience because you really circle around and you've got incredible views from all points. Like this one. And it's, again, the kind of vegetation, it's what's known as fynbos, fine bush, which is one of the 9 biomes of the world. Back to the city. Now, this is the company's garden, known as the company's garden, and this is the St. George's Mall, the pedestrian way. The desire to get back to the sea, because the Cape Townians, they've been in love with the ocean and they've lost it. So what can we do? And then the opportunity arises to redevelop or upgrade or make use of the old harbour, because the new harbour is now operational. Here you've got a cluster of buildings over 300 years old, and it's really underutilized. So like many other places around the world, Boston, right here, the waterfront upgrade, it happened to around about that same time. Vancouver, San Francisco, Sydney, what have you. So this was the opportunity to, again, because of the harbour development, was the opportunity to kind of re-link, to be able to link back to the ocean, not a straight line, but at least a diagonal that brings you back into the city. So a master plan was developed, and it looked at all the opportunities that it offered, and it's too many details to go into, but again, there was an old portion of it, the historic Pierhead, where a number of buildings, most of the old buildings could be reused, and they are being reused and repurposed. And for instance, this is a hotel, which was a rope shed. A huge area that was excavated in about the 40s in order to expand the harbour, but then they find that it was just too small. So that was retained and was turned into a marina, residential marina. Just for the very first phase, the probably most historic part of the harbour, but you can see all these buildings are existing buildings that has been retained, turned into something else, office, restaurants, and so on. So the network that you can see here is quite important because a lot of emphasis was put on the quality, the character of the old harbour, that we don't just create new. Okay, I've got to run. But that that character is being retained and incorporated into the systems. And I'm going to skip a few things, but these are some of the old buildings that have been retained and restored and is now being used extremely well. This is the sort of one portion of it. You can see the linking of the various spaces and carries on and forms a whole network within that space. Some of the squares, Nobel Prize winners' place. Nelson Mandela is there, and part of that group. So it's a kind of space that accommodates a lot of different things and bring a lot of variety in a place. A no swimming place here, very popular for bathing. This is the old tank farm, as they call it, the big hole dugout. It's now a marina, quality of the marina. A lot of emphasis being put on landscape. I mean, landscape architects now, it's been really integral to the whole team effort here, right from the beginning, not added later on. And then a few years later, we had the opportunity to have this soccer, the FIFA soccer event, the Soccer Cup 2010, and Cape Town had to build a stadium, and the stadium was chosen to be in that particular position. The Cape Town Common, which is this area over here. Here's the old gardens, different land. There's the connection going through the common. And that was the site itself here, it was an old sports field, in fact, given to the state or given by the state to the city for the use of recreation and sport only. There's, right next to the waterfront development, and then, of course, the city centre and taking you up to the mountain there. So we're beginning to follow this whole link system. That is the site. It was fairly redundant and overused and not a particularly attractive environment. A whole new reconfiguration of that space had to be done to golf course, amongst others, but because of the placing of the stadium over here. And then again, the mayor said there's got to be a park, which it really wasn't. It was meant to be a park, but there wasn't a park. So this corner was sort of allocated as a park. And this park is doing all the many things that a park should do. I mean, all the things we've learned from the Americas and from England and so on, and visiting, all the playgrounds and the real wonderful full facilities. I mean, the ideas was just compressed. And the one thing that actually made it happen, because the city up to this stage, every 10 years there will be a master plan, but never implemented. In this case, there was a deadline. It had to be done because of the event. Secondly, there was a political will because the mayor said it's got to be. And thirdly, the money was allocated. So with all those things, we will still be looking at it. So I'm just going to run through it very quickly. There's a link to the city. This is the city station, which we call the fan mile, which happens when there's an event or any other time. It's very well used by all sorts of activities. The traffic circle was raised so that people can flow freely underneath it from the station. There you can see the event. It was actually an amazing decision because the engineer couldn't believe that we could even think of doing that. Because they wanted to go over bridges and so on. So it couldn't happen. Many different events happen here on an annual basis. The park itself, it really is focused on a little common, as we called it. There's a major lineal pathway that goes through here, focused on a lighthouse in the Atlantic Ocean over there. The water is a very important item here, because the water that you see is for irrigation purposes. There's really a bunch of reservoirs that has been used intensively as this sort of multifunctional aspect of green infrastructure. Really starts to make sense in this sort of situation. And just some detailed aspects of it. Many variations and items and things to do. And it's become extremely popular. I don't know what the visitations, but on a Sunday, a good Sunday, it could be 3,000 to 5,000 people on 12 hectares, which is quite good. And it's become a beautiful thing. It's actually brought the Cape Townians together from whatever culture or color or age you are. Everybody can come here. I mean, the elderly people in particularly, because it's safe and secure. And it's close by. Another aspect. And of course, it was very much oriented to accommodate disabled wherever, not just in this way and fashion, but even the play structures were tuned in so that kids with disabilities could use it. That's the old pathway to the lighthouse. This is the new one here. The way of being used. The fountain's part of the spring where the water comes from the mountain and then spills into the irrigation dams, which are all features in both the golf course and the park amphitheater. People just doing their own thing. In theater, another event. A lot of these kinds of events happen on a regular basis in the park. And the park lends itself to it, and as individuals or small groups, you can do what you want and perform. Walking across the water is a very popular activity, and feeding the ducks. And this is biodiversity. We call it the show garden, biodiversity show garden, because it can't really be proper. It's relatively small, but it does show people, it educates people about what kind of soils, what kind of binds with what kind of vegetation, and those kind of, what is the wildlife that associates with certain plants and so on. So, in a way, our necklace is slowly coming together. We're here at the mountain. We've seen we can get up the mountain. This is still to be done. It's on the board. These are the gardens, and these are some of the smaller spaces. Link to the common and to the and that is the final product. Now, if I have a second, have a second? No. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. Have I taken up your time?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And hello. I just want to start by saying thank you. I think Dean has left. Thank you to Dean Sarah Whiting. Thank you, Gareth, for the invite. Gary, Jacob, who we learned today. Sarah, I think Raquel, Matt Smith for putting this all together. And thank you all for coming. It's a little bit emotional today. This is standing here after, I think, 15, 16 years. We gave a presentation at the start of KDI. And I'm now here and able to see my former student, Martha, and an alumni of KDI also here, and Toby, who unfortunately I have not met despite looking for me several times in Nairobi, Kenya. Currencies, and I think Gareth alluded to this. It was so amazing that we were using similar words, and we first started thinking about it in terms of pluralities. Have I got that right? But also in terms of exchange, in terms of flows. And it was intriguing that Gareth had asked us to speak about the current practice. And for us, currencies just seemed to be moving. And so we figured that, we would start with past, present, and future, because really, for us, currencies is really a reflection at a point in time. I think I jumped into that a bit quickly, and I should have just left it up there, because this allows me to reflect that Africa is perhaps the most, not perhaps, is the most diverse continent, genetically, economically, culturally. And I put this up because this is a point in time in my past that I managed to find. And I like to use it as both my reflection on landscape and the city. This is maybe I was 12, 13 years old, and I was painting transportation in my country. But one of the things that keeps coming back to me is the rolling landscapes. Fast forward, sorry, I went back. Fast forward, I'm an architecture student. This is almost 10 years later in 1997. And this is a project on low-income housing. I was an architecture student, and there was a lot that I enjoyed in the analysis and the asking of questions, in the thinking through the different problems of low-income housing in a space that we'll speak about a little bit more in Kibera. And I fully began to understand the poem by Henry Barlow, I refuse to take your brotherly hand. Your nails are black with dirt, brother, and your palms are clammy with sweat. I refuse to take the hand you extend in help. But I did help. At least those were my solutions back then. And reflections as to why I was presenting that way. And this came back full circle. And this is a lot later in life. I've now been sketching a lot from life. But I began to reflect on the African city. I spoke about Africa being the most diverse. And I think one of the few things we hold in common, probably with the exception of two countries, Liberia and Ethiopia, is fairly recent European colonialism. And when I think about that European colonialism, I also think about the perceptions it gave us for the city and the way we view our city. And I guess that's why I was painting the rolling hills, despite the fact that they were not there. And so this is the Garden City, Ebenezer Howard, one of the things that we hold true, especially when we are teaching landscape architecture, even in the continent. And sorry, Graham, I put that up. And I think Graham put this very well because he began to speak about us, and this I think was from the IFLA Africa Journal, which I know we'll speak about if we can, began to speak to the fact that we need to really be thinking about the continent from our perspective and from ways in which we can reflect and think about. And this is what I thought I wanted. We've been able to sketch that. That's KICC. This is from Uhuru Park. I don't know exactly when it was done, but again, water features, rolling hills. The green city in the sun, and that's the moniker for Nairobi. And we stepped back and began to think, what was landscape like circa 2006 in Kenya? We had a budding university, Jomo Kenyatta University. I think by that time, we had probably graduated one class. But majority of the work we were doing was focused on the private realm. Just simple pictures like this. I forget where this was. This was from one of the places that I think we visited with Chelina. And beautiful landscapes, and this was the aspiration. This is what we were teaching, and this is what we had been figuring landscape was. And I think it eventually, I go back to the solution and the understanding of the solution that I had given, and realized that all that had been cultured into me up until that point, into me thinking about that as the only form of landscape architecture. And it was then good that I had the opportunity to come to the GSD. And this is where, along with 5 other students, Chelina being one of them, I'll just tell you quickly, Chelina is not a landscape architect officially. But it was fantastic that she joined the group, along with Ellen Schneider, Kach Vorikan, Jen Toy, and Patrick Curran. And we began asking questions from all the things that we were listening to about the expanse and the diversity of landscape. And we began to think of a different way to practice that was not necessarily driven by the picturesque, that was driven by experience, by listening to others, by provoking. And I must say, they provoked me. This is one of the things that's very interesting. By activating, and then by amplifying. And so we're just going to take you through a brief journey over the last 15 years of the practice, in a way in which the practice from Kenya informed the practice globally. And so this was really Africa exporting landscape architecture.
Thanks, Arthur. It was these initial abstract and somewhat amorphous ideas that eventually became what we now call KDI. And when we think about it, our global practice really is what it is today, precisely because it started in Kenya when it did, and with the state of the discipline, as Arthur just described it, focused primarily on the private realm. You see, we had a different idea about practice, almost the inverse of this, of the definition of landscape architecture in Kenya at the time. Our point of inquiry as students was, what is the role of landscape architecture in the public realm? And specifically in addressing the biggest challenges that the public realm faces in Kenya, in Nairobi, but even further afield. And as Arthur just mentioned, this wasn't the most accepted or recognized form of landscape architecture at the time in Kenya, but that actually turned out to be okay, because we weren't seeking any official endorsement by the profession at the time, but rather we were just trying to get things done that the community in Kibera, where we first started our work, expressed needed doing. And the profession didn't really identify what we were doing as landscape, and that ended up helping us define a mode of practice very much shaped outside of any disciplinary structure or watchful eye. And instead, our mode of practice was very much shaped by landscapes, but these were the physical landscapes of Kibera, which is a large informal settlement about the size of Central Park in New York. It's informal, it's very dense, there's no vacant land or public space. It has very complicated topography and river tributaries that cut through it, creating really complicated urban flooding conditions. So that physical landscape was a really important driver of our practice. But also the political landscape at the time, a period between 2002 and 2010 that was very democratically engaged. It was a period that truly marked the end for Kenya of one-party rule. And in Kibera in particular, this is a time when youth especially were demanding their rights to the city, and they were demanding their right to a just public realm. So our practice was inherently defined by that landscape as well. And then it was also defined by the social landscape of Kibera. Again, at the time where traditional gender roles of a colonial society, with women as homemakers and caretakers, was still overwhelmingly the dominant household structure and the accepted form of life in Kibera. So it was these landscape structures that shaped our practice, not the disciplinary constraint of landscape architecture as it was currently defined at the time. And that freedom to define a model of practice in response to the needs of a place, instead of in response to the expectations of a profession, ended up being deeply beneficial. It was deeply beneficial to the communities in Kibera, yes, but also to us as practitioners at the beginning of our careers, because we were able to find success and confidence in this non-traditional mode of practice that was shaped by the landscapes of Kenya, and specifically Kibera. And then we saw the value and the opportunity, and in fact the need, to share that knowledge and definition of practice in other places, for example in the US, the place that I called home. And that sharing and moving of knowledge ultimately has created this cycle of reciprocal learning that is still very much at the heart of our practice at KDI. So I want to just share 3 quick projects that are examples of how that reciprocal learning plays out. Each of these projects, each of these kind of principles grew out of that original project in Kibera, and they really set the foundations of how we practice. From that project in Kibera, we've established a core principle of how we practice, a core process of how we approach design and planning, and even some of the actual design products or outputs that we see repeated as themes in our work. So let's just look quickly at those. I'll start by kind of explaining this project in Kibera that was our first project, started as a student project here in 2006. And the first aspect of the project that I'll highlight is the way that we established a fundamental principle of our practice, which we call productive public space. So in Kibera, as I mentioned, it's very dense. There is no available land. There is no purpose-built public space, or there wasn't at the time. And yet there were so many needs that residents expressed around shared amenities, around public space, around safe places to be. So as we began to engage residents about how to meet those needs without the availability of land, and we began to see opportunity in leftover spaces. And this is something I'll come back to. These were spaces that were along the riverine spaces that cut through the settlement that were deemed unbuildable or challenges for flooding, but we really saw them as places of opportunity. The problem was there weren't many of them, and there were so many needs. So we began to think about how we would layer activities, amenities, and elements into one space. So rather than thinking of a public space as just a place for leisure and recreation, what we began to hear from residents was that it needed these other layers of economic activity, of social opportunity, not only because there wasn't enough space to create these amenities in separate places throughout the settlement, but also because without the economic layer, without the social layer, the future stability of the site could not be guaranteed. So out of necessity and out of the political, social, and physical landscape, this idea of making a public space work harder for a community became a real foundational principle of how we work. And ultimately, we transformed that site into what we called our first productive public space. That led to beginning a network of productive public spaces that cut throughout the entire settlement along these riparian corridors, Today, there's a series of 12 of these productive public spaces, all designed to meet the unique needs of the neighborhood directly around it. And this public space network, as it grew, began to have resonance in other places that we knew of, particularly the eastern Coachella Valley, which couldn't be more different physically from Kibera. It's rural farm worker communities, unincorporated communities in Southern California. But still, there were many of the same conditions: no purpose-built public space, no amenities for gathering, no safe places to be. And so and very few resources to build all of these needs and address all of these needs one by one. So this idea of making a public space work harder for communities took root quite easily and was welcomed and adopted and embraced by residents who had been advocating for these public spaces for years. So in the same way that one space became two and two became three in Kibera, the same happened here in the eastern Coachella Valley, and continues to be part of our work in other places beyond, in Los Angeles and other sites across the country. The second piece that grew out of that original project was a foundational element of our process. So when we started at this very same project, we had this ideal that we needed to have women as part of the design process. And our goal was to have a third or half of the community members driving the process be women. But what you see from this photo is we didn't really have to try hard. In fact, it was all women. And eventually we had to recruit men just to get some gender balance in the mix. But again, that was driven by the social landscape that I described a minute ago. We didn't think much of it, we didn't really call it much, but what we noticed is that in every aspect, from problem definition to design, to advocacy and community outreach, to design critique and review, and even through to construction, women were leading the way. And what we began to notice after that first site is that these public spaces look different than the parks that we might have imagined designing ourselves. They had things like weaving cooperatives designed into them, gardens, laundry, shared laundry facilities, daycare centers. And those spaces became immediately the most used spaces among the site, but also they were the things that attracted the whole community to use a space and keep it active. Again, we didn't think much of it, and then one day I got a phone call from Diane Davis, who many of you know, and she said, I know your work involves a lot of women in Kibera, and I have an idea. And what that led to was our own recognition of something unique about our process that had been shaped by the landscape of Kibera. And this was essentially what it meant to take a gender-inclusive approach to planning and design. That led to a studio in Mendoza, Argentina, where we took this park that was off limits to women, designed a process that became the first gender-inclusive process for design adopted by the federal government in Argentina, worked at this specific site with students through the studio. Students designed a gender-inclusive vision for this park. Residents voted on it. And today that park is built and thriving, and I think stands as perhaps certainly the first gender-inclusive, purpose-built park in Argentina, if not North and South America. That work continued, this process of reciprocal learning and expansion into a gender handbook, a handbook on gender-inclusive planning and design that we authored for the World Bank, and then into specific work in the realm of transportation in Los Angeles, where we learned from the disparities in accessing transit for women from our work in Kenya, recognized it in the US, and then began to study it, quantify it, and ultimately turn it into an action plan that has been adopted by the city for how to take a gender-inclusive approach to transportation. And then just to close, I want to talk about one other aspect that came out of that first project, which we see as a recurring theme in our work, and it's the best P word I could come up with was product, but really it's a design outcome or a typology that we use in places in the US and further abroad that originates from that work in Kibera. As I mentioned, many of the productive public spaces that are in the network are at the edges of the river tributaries that cut through the settlement. They are essentially reclaimed waste spaces. That was forced by necessity of the physical landscape in Kibera. It was also a requirement that when we built those spaces, they be temporary, and that's because of the political landscape of Kibera. In Kibera, all of the land is owned by the government. All of the structures are owned by middle-class Kenyans, and all of the occupants are renters that pay rent to middle-class Kenyans that live outside of Kibera in the formal part of the city. So except for a very small portion of Kibera, there's no such thing as a title to land. So this idea of reclaiming waste spaces and building with temporary materials and in a semi-permanent way as a pathway to more permanent infrastructure was again something born out of necessity and born out of the physical and social political landscapes. So this was our very first structure, and in fact, this is a second iteration of it. The first version was even more kind of ephemeral and provisional in the materials. And the space that was reclaimed was just one of many that were former dumping sites, spaces thought of as unuseful and unproductive in the community, and in fact, nuisances in many ways. And so when we began to work on a similar lack of public space in Los Angeles and realized that there was, again, no available land that was affordable, that was easily accessible to build public spaces in half of the city that doesn't have access to public spaces, we again had reference from that first work in Kenya that gave us an idea. We realized that though there wasn't land available for purchase or land that we could afford, there were over 2,000 city-owned vacant lots in Los Angeles, and these were very much in the parts of the city that didn't have public spaces. There was no way to access them. Most of them looked like this. They weren't of any benefit to communities, and in fact, they were quite a bit of nuisance. And we had this understanding of a typology or of an approach to design that both thought about how we could reclaim these waste spaces, but then how we could create provisional design tools, provisional elements that could quickly transform these spaces into usable amenities and use that as a first step toward permanency. So we now have we were able to change city ordinance to make this a viable way of adopting public space in the city of LA, designed this kit of parts, and now there is a growing network. I think we're at 6 or so of these adopted lots in Los Angeles, and this program, just to kind of bring full circle that reciprocal learning, is something that has grown to other cities in the US that we've helped kind of spread the process and the knowledge, but has even begun to re-influence our work on waste space in Kenya. And we're doing a project now with the French Development Bank where we are reclaiming waste spaces in kind of this networked way in other parts of Nairobi. And this is just another project where that same approach was taken, and that temporal approach to the landscape paved the way to this permanent affordable housing and mixed-use development. I'll give it to you, Arthur, to close.
So what's been interesting is that what began in Kenya in rethinking the practice, and I think Chelina had shared this before and after, is now informing the practice both globally, both in LA, both in Sweden, but more so, even more in Kenya. And right now the reflection, and what I'll actually do is I'll just read directly from a conversation we were having with Chelina as we prepared. And Chelina asked me a question, and my response was, it makes a lot of sense. A challenge I still grapple with to date. Chelina was asking if we can really say that the practice has changed our definitions for landscape. It's not crazy talk, and maybe we can be a little bit more robust and continue to grapple with the value and type of the land of our practice. As I mentioned, KDI brings a tear to my eye when I think of pushing the narrative of public realm in Kenya. It is a conversation that we now must spark. And I think what I was speaking to here is that our perception and our understanding of public space is very limited, almost to what I mentioned at the beginning, almost as a gift from a government or a gift from a leader to the public, rather than as a right. And it's the very question I asked Chelina, why we were able to scale up some things very quickly in certain places and maybe not as fast in Kenya. And it's what we are really working on now. And I have also reflected on how different and informative this experience has been. Landscape has not been enclosed. I say this with due respect to a lot of my colleagues back in JKUAT. I would often hear them in critiques ask students, but where is the landscape? Or now give us a landscape solution. You being a planner, that's Chelina, and Joe, our other partner, being an engineer, and the myriad of professionals who have worked with the practice have truly shaped the practice. And I like to think that in a growing space like Kenya, and I want to say Africa, breaking definitions is key. And I think that's really to the world. We were able to break the definition of landscape because this was a growing practice. KDI is doing that repeatedly, even for me. I'm constantly getting new challenges and new ways of thinking, and really the next step for Africa is to really recolonize the public realm. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you, and please, Johan, please join us. I just want to start by saying thank you and noting, because when you put together a set of talks and a panel and a group of people, there's always a conversation about how are we going to overlap. And I'm deeply honored that the three of you really spoke to some of the issues that we discussed. Reciprocity was really important. And this idea of how we're learning back and forth, that learning is not a one-way. And we also mentioned really briefly that all three of you came to the GSD as students and went out, and initially we're going to talk about that. But I'm actually more curious, given your talks, to have you each talk about the kinds of questions that centering the practices that you've articulated today, particularly in the public realm, what are the kinds of questions that you think we might be centering in our work as both in landscape architecture as a practice, but even more broadly in terms of design and thinking about the built environment in the public realm? Maybe turn some of your principles into the questions.
Well, I'll just add a quick one because it's one that's always on the top of our mind wherever we're working, which is how public is the public realm. And I think we especially among planners and landscape architects and the design professions, we talk about it as if it's this, that it lives up to its definition, that the public realm is really free and inclusive and accessible and welcoming to everyone, regardless of gender, race, income, etc. But I think we can all easily think of all of the ways in which the public realm is not that for so many different kinds of people and communities of people. And so to me, that's a question that's always at the center of the work. How public or unpublic is the public realm, and what is our role as keepers and shapers of the public realm in pushing it toward that ideal utopian definition of what public means?
If I understood right, you asked what are the questions that we should be asking. And wow, I ask myself lots of questions every day. I think maybe just to start off with is really to understand culture, understand tradition, understand authenticity. And this I try to speak to a lot to our students, to be able to go to a place, assess it for what it is without any biases, without any preconceived ideas, either way. Mm-hmm. And when I mean either ways, I sometimes find they, to a fault, want to be African mm-hmm. in what everybody might think African is, as opposed to being African from an authentic perspective. Or in other flip sides, they then want to be totally out of this African experience. And one of the things we didn't mention is I had been working a little bit and just thinking about the housing thing in Kibera when we first brought up the KDI thing. And when we were forming the group, I think everybody said, let's go start in Kibera. And I said, no, I don't think we can do that. That's going to be way too difficult. Now, here I was, the African in the room, saying that's too difficult because I wasn't quite sure if this was really what we were about. And that has also allowed me to reflect that a movement, I need to be careful about this term that I use, but I'll use it anyway because it's in Ed Glaser's book on Triumph of the City, and he says that all majority of progress in cities is done by immigrants and migrants. And this is not just migrants in the sense of country to country. When I think of Nairobi, majority of the people are migrants from the rural areas into Nairobi. And they make the difference. And here I was in the US presenting Kibera and not wanting to do it, but Chelina and the rest of the team migrated to Nairobi. I was still working in the US and began a practice that has now caused me to rethink the way I think about public space. So I don't know if I answered your question, but somewhere in there are many questions just whirling through my mind about how do we truly get what is authentic about something that's so diverse, and so as diverse as Africa and as diverse as landscape. Yeah.
Beautiful, thank you.
The public domain for me is place where I think attempt to find common ground. And particularly in the South African context, where, excuse me, we've been through some major changes over the last 40 years, 30 years. And we're trying to bring people together in space. And it is in the public domain where it really happens. In you know, private situations is very different. I mean, you choose who you want to invite in that space. So I tend to look for what is common to the public, even within cities or even with countries. The needs that people search for in interaction and contact with others doesn't vary that much from culture to culture. I don't think so. I would find the way we deal with space in, you know, urban design becomes a very important factor here, because again, it's apart from the space that you create, it's the activities that surround it, or that interact with that space, or that make that space, or frame that space, or give it definition, which makes a difference on how people interact with that space and within themselves. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, I can't really say much more than that.
No, I appreciate those. And I guess I would bring it back to our discussion of the GSD. And one of the pieces that I think is important is for us to learn the questions, right? How do we ask? And it's woven into your talks, and I really appreciate it. I wanted to make sure there was time actually for the audience. You are also deep thinkers, so let me open it up. I certainly have pages of questions, but and yes, there is a microphone coming down on both sides, so does anybody? Yes, we have one right up here in the front. And if you could just identify yourself briefly, that would be terrific.
Yeah. I'm Carrie Duncan. I'm South African, but I live and work in Morocco, and I'm part of IFLA Africa as well. I just wanted to react to something that Arthur said about assessing a place without any biases. And I'm just thinking to myself that that's an impossible task, because our cognitive pathways are formed by what we know and what we've experienced in our lives. So even when we think we're thinking out of the box about something, we can only think out of the box as far as some sort of experience we've had or something that we might know about might inspire us to do. So I think that the way we react in terms of forming public space or working on projects, it just has to be influenced by our life experience, wherever that has been. And we can't do things that we've never seen or imagined or been exposed to in some kind of way. So it comes from a deep understanding of our own personal experience that we try and interpret into our project. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary. You might have noticed I caught myself a little bit when I was saying that, and of course I knew you'd catch it. Maybe what I meant to say is, and I've spoken to this before, understanding the origins of our biases. So it's not to say that you can go there without biases, but if we begin to understand, and it's not easy, I would agree with you, it's not easy for me to go tell a student that no, Uhuru Park, I speak of Uhuru Park in Nairobi, Uhuru Park. So let me just put context. Nairobi last year had some very serious, what we're calling them Gen Z riots, when the young people went and rioted against a Finance Act. And I was reflecting, I think I might have told you this in ASLA, and I was reflecting at some point that Uhuru Park, which is the largest park in Nairobi, say Central Park, was closed down for 2 years. and nobody rioted. And I was trying to understand what's the disconnect there. Why is it that they would riot about the Finance Act, which was, of course, affecting them directly? Digital creators were going to be, taxed heavily, and it was fascinating to see. But Uhuru Park, the largest park, had been fenced for 2 years, and nobody had rioted. And I thought, this is something wrong. And I think when I was at IFLA Africa, I wrote a message to Regina, who is a lawyer and advocate in KDI, and said, we need to sue the county. And then I actually wrote to a lawyer a message and said, we need to sue. And they said, oh, sorry, don't worry. Greenbelt Movement, Wangari Maathai's daughter has already sued, and it's in progress. But even as we speak right now, it's fenced. And we don't particularly understand why. We don't realize that there's something wrong with that. And even I would speak quietly about it. I know that I was approached at one point, and I said, if you're doing a fence, I will not do it. I will not lie that I have not been involved in other projects that had fences around public parks. But that's the difficulty with which we need to navigate and continuously educate about the origins of the biases. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you. Charles, right up there. And again, please introduce yourself.
Thank you all. Charles Birnbaum, lecturer in landscape architecture and president of the Cultural Landscape Foundation. I think this question is for the last two speakers specifically. I want to just say that I came to this conference with, I think shallow is almost an exaggeration in terms of my knowledge of African landscape architecture practice today. I've seen Chelina present before, and one of the things I found myself seeing parallels with today is the nature of landscape architecture when we were reclaiming cities in the 60s here in the US. Perhaps I have Paul Friedberg on my mind right now with his recent passing and his handcrafted playgrounds and his leveling of the playing field in community-based design in terms of gender and ethnicity. But specifically what I wanted to ask the last panel about is this notion of moving beyond landscape architecture as we may think of it in these hallowed halls, and looking back at the work of Lawrence Halpern and Jim Burns, for example, in terms of public engagement. I saw some real parallels in the frameworks and typologies that you were presenting. And I'm wondering if this is just something that I have on my brain or if it's in the ether. Thank you.
Well, I think that kind of ties back to what influence the GSD has had on each of our practices. And certainly I can say that one of the ways that we all connected is, as Arthur has revealed, I am not a landscape architect. Honorary, right, is because of this place and the way that, yes, there are disciplinary boundaries, but they're encouraged to be broken and crossed over here at the GSD. And so I think we first met in a class that was traversing those boundaries, where we were thinking at a scale that I had never thought about before, like intercontinental transportation routes. And we were being asked to think about not just kind of the design outcomes and the formal outcomes, but the political negotiations and the engagement processes. And we were having to, like, the success of our project depended not just on the success of our form or just on the success of our policy approach, but the successful integration of both. And I think, so we were exposed to all of the kinds of things and the people that you just mentioned, but we were exposed to where those intersections were and how important it was to kind of think about things simultaneously and as systems in order to produce real outcomes. And I think that is in the origins of KDI, but it's also absolutely the way we operate today. So I know you had a question.
Please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sichaba Mape. I'm from Johannesburg. I'm an architect, not a landscape architect. Johan, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were on the way in which people use the kind of spaces that you've designed. In Johannesburg, often people who come from the rural areas, when they migrate into the city, they use public spaces and parks to express their culture. So often they'll do rituals and various other activities that are not necessarily what was planned for those public spaces. And I just wonder, in a place like Cape Town, do you see that? Do you see the way in which these spaces are designed to afford that kind of opportunity?
Yeah, in fact, it's the flexibility of the spaces. Public spaces, open spaces, especially the larger parks, or average size community parks, it's got a flexibility to it. It's got openness about it. So you can relatively easily accommodate different sort of activities. If it requires specific things or cover or hard surface, because I know one instance that I have quite a bit of experience with is people performing in a park, formally, dancers in particular, and how it's changed from the old days when you had to have a spring timber floor to dance on, where you could now do on any, whether it's grass or stone or whatever, or even water. You can walk on water, So people adapt to those kind of conditions and can apply. And I hear what you say. I know Cape Town also, there are cultural groups who do certain activities in a certain manner. And it's quite beautiful to watch because, again, that brings in this other component of what is recreation and which is the old thing about the most popular sport in America is people watching people watching people. And these are the kind, again, when people are in a park, they are there not just because of the open space, but also because of the sharing of the park with other people. Whether you are friends or a group of the same group, it is the thing about seeing what other people are doing and that interaction. And I find that particularly this last park, that the Greenpoint Common, which has been a huge success, because it is so well furnished for different activities and it accommodates the diverse groups of people. I mean, young kids having birthday parties all the time. It's filled with people. It's too small, in fact, for all of these kind of activities that want to happen there. So I think, again, it's you can't specifically design for this unless it's a specialized space for a particular activity.
Actually, I think that's a beautiful question to turn to the other two as well, if that's okay. Just thinking about your users, you design, you build.
I know we missed you for a question, and I want to make sure we get to you.
Yeah.
So we'll be super quick.
Okay.
I think one of the key things which maybe we didn't speak to a lot is most of our spaces are co-designed. So we spend a lot of time with the actual users to try and figure out what it is they want. And when we say co-designed, sometimes we don't get to fit everything. And we could speak a lot to the entire process of helping them figure out sizes and all that. So if people say they wanted a golf course and, you actually physically begin to show them and it reaches a point. But they're normally very, very clear about some of the things they're interested in. So, but that question would then form, some of the learnings would then form what we would do in larger public spaces, and we still feel that the co-design process should be able to work, and those are our goals.
I would just add that the example that I shared from that very first project, it continues to be the case wherever it is that we're working. I can look at most of our final products in terms of parks and public spaces and say, I'd point to at least 2 or 3 elements of the design that absolutely would not appear in the park if our core team of designers were doing that work on our own.
Great. We're going to have one last question, and then we might do a quick answer. So,
Yeah, actually, you sort of hit on it, the question that I was going to ask about the spiritual context within many of the spaces. And I've done some work in Ghana and also in Kenya, in Kisumu. And one of the things that I see happening oftentimes, people coming in from the outside as well, there's a sort of layering of almost like an international style of landscaping, and I think you have to be careful of that type of sort of Mayan concept, because there's an example in Ghana, a tree that is in the middle of a street has, it's got spiritual powers as far as the neighborhood. So they've actually had to, carve around or drive around and walk around. So I guess my question, have you run into, like, I think the areas where you guys are working where it's more migrants is a little different, but where there are fewer, cultural experience really matters in the way that you come in, and then just to that end, what was your experience coming out? Because oftentimes when I take students abroad, I have to tell them, you're not superheroes. You're not coming here to save anyone. You're coming here to have a dialogue with the community, their clients, just like anyone else. So I just want to know what your experience was. And then also, have you had an experience with spiritual context within the landscape itself?
I'll be quick. Again, thankfully, because the only thing we knew when we started in Kibera is that we really didn't know much. Arthur had grown up outside of Kibera, but also wasn't super familiar with the community itself. And we had been rooted and trained in these and had adopted as our approach this kind of community engaged process to design. So the one thing we knew is that if we were going to be at all useful, we would have to be led by and invited by the people that called the space home. And so we started by just literally, Arthur knew one person who agreed to give us a walking tour of Kibera, and we started walking around, being introduced to people, meeting people, and kind of making our own connections. And it was those people that taught us really quickly all the things that could have led to ridiculous blunders on our part. People told us, "Oh, do you think you're the first group of students to come to Kibera? Do you think we really have 8 hours to spend with you each day for the next 2 weeks?" Just very, very honest dialogue that helped us, before we even got started, realize all the other things that we didn't know. And those too have shaped our practice fundamentally and foundationally for every place that we work. So to your question of how did I feel kind of after that first trip or that first interaction, I felt like I had a responsibility to right the wrongs in the way that the community had told me that I needed to. And the first thing they said to us is, if you want us to take you seriously, don't spend your time here showing us the pretty design that you will have after 2 weeks. If you want us to take you seriously, come back. And when you show up a second time, then we'll talk.
do we want? Very quick, Gareth, because otherwise you're going to get mad at me.
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, this is just in the spirit of engaging our African audience. So I have a question on WhatsApp from Amin Matouk. Amin is a student of architecture at the School of Architecture and Urbanism in Tunis. And he has a question for Arthur. Where he said, if it's possible, I have a question for Arthur regarding what he said about how scaling the productive public space model was possible easily and quickly in some contexts, but not in Kenya. What are the key barriers slowing down the process there, and how is he addressing them? Maybe if you give us a quick comment.
Wow, that's a fantastic question, and it's the very question I asked Chelina for us to think about. I didn't think about it enough, but I'll probably say this I think one of the first things is Nairobi in Kenya is an incredibly fast developing country with an incredible amount of human resource. And everybody has a good idea. And the government is very bullish about wanting to get things done. So one of the things that we are struggling with, and I say this carefully right now, is the president set up a Nairobi River Commission that was seeking to clean the entire Nairobi River. And so what they want to do is just make a beautiful park. And KDI is involved. And we are consistently in meetings trying to explain to them the process that we've gone through. One of the things that happened that was saved by the Gen Z riots is there's a time they were actually going to demolish a number of our productive public spaces, and we're trying to tell them the time investment. So what we are struggling with in scaling up is trying to make it clear that these things can actually be scaled up and they matter. And because, however well-meaning, the administration, and I say administration, not government, the administration imagine that they're going to bequeath this beautiful park. So speaking to little productive public spaces, long processes of community engagement is not something that they would be fully interested in. And I think that's, I haven't told this to Chelina, but I think that was one of the reasons why it was a little bit easier. And let's be honest, I think some of the things that happened around the pandemic and the COVID times also enabled some of the administrations on this end, where they were working in Coachella, to look to be more inclusive about how you develop parks. So it's very, very layered. I could write to a lot of several other things. I could be speaking on this throughout, but it's a fantastic question, and one that really is reflective of very many spaces in Africa, I would say.
Just beautiful question to end with. I just want to have all of us join in thanking you. We have so much more to learn with you over the next couple of days, and all of you who are here as speakers. Thank you, and I think I'm turning this over to Gary.
Thank you all. Really an engaging conversation as we launch this conference. Just want to take a quick moment, but an important one, for recognition. As Dean Whiting mentioned in her opening remarks, we were thrilled to acknowledge that this is Johan's first time back at GSD since graduating with his Master of Landscape Architecture in 1975. One always would love to have a strong hand in the evolution of the public realm in your town. Imagine the strength of that hand here. You showed us amazing work over the 50 years since we've last seen you, and we want to congratulate you, and we have a gift.